The Kings and Queens of Scotland. Part 3. The Wars of Independence, 1286 to 1437. Magnificent and rugged, Scotland has long been a country of fierce independence and brutal power struggles. In parts 1 and 2, we met the ancient MacAlpin warrior kings, who fought off Vikings and bound kingdoms together, and the Dunkeld cousins, including Macbeth, who murdered each other over the throne, and tried to take advantage of the Norman invasion of England. In this episode, we'll see Scotland go through its most tumultuous century, beginning with its first tragic Queen Regnant, through the Wars of Independence, where we'll learn what Braveheart and Outlaw King got right and wrong about William Wallace and Robert the Bruce, ending up with the accession of the Stewart Dynasty, who would rule Scotland for 300 years. House of Spada. Margaret, the Maid of Norway, was Scotland's first queen in her own right. After the sudden deaths of her mother and uncles, she was the only surviving descendant of King Alexander III. But she was only 3 years old and still in Norway. In her absence, the men with the next best claims to the throne, Robert Bruce and John Balliol, squared off, and civil war looked imminent. In order to keep the peace, 6 leading nobles formed the Guardians of Scotland. They subdued Bruce and Balliol and got other lords and clerics to agree to support little Margaret's empty throne. They needed to get her there to fill it. But her father, King Eric I of Norway, was reluctant to send his baby girl so far away. The Guardians turned to Edward I of England to intercede. He saw opportunity and wanted to wed little Margaret to his own infant son. As father-in-law to the Queen, he would have power over Scotland. King Edward persuaded Eric to ship Margaret, now 7, to Scotland, and he sent his own luxurious vessel to retrieve her. But Margaret's crossing was treacherous, and her ship was battered by storms. She arrived in Orkney terribly ill, either from food poisoning or severe seasickness. She died in the arms of the Bishop of Narv, far from home, and having just set foot in the kingdom she would never know. Her body was taken back to Norway. Her father demanded to see her and confirm that it was really his child who had perished. She was buried next to her mother in Bergen. 10 years later, a woman claimed to be the long-lost Queen Margaret, but she had no proof and was closer to 40 than 17, so she was burned at the stake. First interregnum, 1290 to 1292. With Margaret's death, Scotland lost everything they'd hoped for in their treaty with Norway and England, and they'd opened the door to powerful King Edward I. He had already conquered Wales and put the Welsh princes' heads on spikes. He granted his son the title Prince of Wales, which the English heir apparent has held ever since. Edward demanded that the contenders for the Scottish throne, Bruce and Balliol, come to him. He threw his substantial weight behind the House of Balliol. John Balliol. He was the 3 times great-grandson of King David I through his mother. His father's family had come from France during the Norman conquest. John grew up in England. He was a 4th son and was probably destined for the church, but the early deaths of his brothers and parents meant he inherited vast estates. His Englishness made him an attractive candidate to Edward, but the 40-year-old baron had not been raised with the regal tenacity needed to hold a throne. A month after his election, John was beckoned south to celebrate Christmas with Edward and to swear fealty to him, making Scotland yet again a vassal to England. Edward further humiliated the Scots by ordering them to fight in France for his personal inheritance. This was too far. A council assembled to sign a treaty with France against England. This was the beginning of centuries of collusion between the two nations, known as the Auld Alliance. They revoked John's homage, and Scotland and England were once again at war. John sided with his barons and attacked Carlisle. Then Edward sacked Berwick and won the Battle of Dunbar. Defeated, John was forced to surrender and abdicate. He hoped that by betraying his kingdom, he would get an English earldom, but Edward was not feeling generous. He ordered John's royal insignia to be literally ripped off his chest. He was thence known as John Emptycloak and was imprisoned in England for 3 years. The Scots attempted to liberate their former king, but John was not interested. Instead, he moved to France, where he lived out the rest of his days in obscurity, dying at 65. Second Interregnum, 1296 to 1306. For a decade, Scotland had no king and was under English control. Edward took the crown jewels and the ancient Stone of Destiny, upon which Scottish kings had been enthroned for centuries. The regalia was lost. The gemstones were likely ripped out and the gold melted down to use in English jewelry. Edward ordered a new throne so that his descendants could be crowned while sitting upon the Stone of Destiny. St. Edward's chair has been used in every English coronation since. The English imposed many abuses on the Scots, though prima nocte, or the right of a lord to have sex with any woman on her wedding night, was a myth perpetuated by the movie Braveheart. William Wallace did emerge as a leader in the Wars of Scottish Independence. He won the Battle of Stirling Bridge, slaughtering many English as they tried to fight their way across a narrow bridge. According to legend, Wallace had the skin of an English lord made into a sword sheath, though this was likely just one of the many myths the terrified English made up about him, including that he was a 7-foot giant. Wallace was appointed Guardian of Scotland, but within 9 months he lost the Battle of Falkirk and went on the run. He evaded the English for 7 years, but was eventually captured. The Scottish hero was dragged naked through the streets of London, then hanged, drawn, and quartered at Smithfield. His head was tarred and spiked on London Bridge, and his 4 limbs were sent across Britannia to illustrate the fate of traitors. But Scotland's spirit was not defeated. Another leader emerged to fight the English. House of Bruce. Robert I, the Bruce, was the grandson of the Robert Bruce who lost the election to John Balliol 14 years earlier. In fact, he was the 7th Robert Bruce in a line stretching back to Normandy before the conquest. He was also the 4 times great-grandson of David I, and with the lack of royal family members, he was at the top of the succession heap. Robert was 6'1" and powerfully built. For many years, he fought with his rival, John Comyn. Comyn was a leader for Scottish independence, while Bruce cooperated with the English, though he did not betray William Wallace, as depicted in Braveheart. The more recent film, Outlaw King, which centers on Robert the Bruce, was much closer to real history. The rivalry between Robert and Comyn came to a head when the 2 men got into an argument in a church, and Robert murdered Comyn. This was a damnable sacrilege, but Scottish lords and churchmen were happy to have a leader who would take charge, and they threw their weight behind Robert anyway. He moved quickly to have himself crowned king at Scone. The English responded with an invasion. Robert was defeated twice, and many of his key supporters were killed or captured. His wife, Elizabeth du Bourgh, daughter, sister, and bishop were taken to England in chains and put in cages on public display. Robert fled to the island of Rathlin. According to legend, he watched a spider repeatedly fall while trying to cast a web across a room. Eventually, the spider succeeded, and Robert was inspired to try again, until he won Scotland's independence. More battles ensued, and 2 more of his brothers were executed. But eventually he learned from his mistakes. He stopped engaging the stronger English army on the battlefield and transitioned to guerrilla warfare. King Edward I died in 1307, and his son, Edward VII, was nothing of the warrior his father had been. For 7 years, Robert continued the fight, slowly taking castles along the border. Finally, he won a decisive victory at the Battle of Bannockburn. In 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath, the world's first declaration of independence, demanded that the English government recognize Scottish sovereignty. Edward II skulked off, but he was young and planned to wait out the older, childless king and strike when Scotland entered yet another succession crisis. Robert's relatives were returned to him, but he and Elizabeth had missed out on prime heir-making years, though he had fathered several illegitimate children while she was in prison. He was now 40, but she was only 25, so they had time. She gave birth to 2 daughters. The kingdom was greatly relieved when twin boys, David and John, finally arrived. Soon after, the queen fell from her horse and died at the age of 38. King Robert was 50 and in poor health. Luckily for him, Edward II was overthrown by his own wife, Isabella of France, and her lover, Roger Mortimer. Isabella's 15-year-old son became Edward III, though she and Mortimer really ran the country. Mortimer tried to march against Scotland, but was defeated and forced to sign a treaty finally acknowledging Scottish independence. To seal the peace, King Edward's 7-year-old sister, Joan of the Tower, was wed to Robert's 4-year-old son, David. Robert died soon after at the age of 55. It was rumored that he suffered from leprosy, and forensic examination of his bones do point to a skin condition, but it is unlikely he would have achieved so much with such a debilitating condition. He more likely had eczema or possibly syphilis. David II was a 5-year-old orphan with a wife to support. His father had appointed 2 trusted regents. The first was killed while carrying the Bruce's heart on crusade. David's brother-in-law, Edward III, was furious with his regent, Mortimer, for signing the peace treaty with Scotland. He overthrew his mother and Mortimer. Mortimer was executed, but the king eventually forgave his mother. Now in control of England, Edward wanted to take back Scotland from young King David. But if he broke the peace treaty, he would be excommunicated. Instead, he backed an alternative claimant to the Scottish throne, Edward Balliol, son of King John Balliol, and gave him an army. Just as the English were closing in, King David's second regent died. A third was appointed, but 9 days in, he was slaughtered in battle, along with thousands of other Scots. Edward Balliol made it to Scone to be crowned, but he was soon chased out of the country. He returned, and this time Edward III backed him up personally. David's 4th regent was captured, and the 5th was killed at the Battle of Halidon Hill, along with nearly all of the remaining Scottish nobles. Now on the throne, Balliol handed southern Scotland over to the English, in thanks for their support. 9-year-old King David faced doom, but salvation came from across the sea. King Philip VI took the young king and queen back to France. He had just started a war with the English over King Edward's claims on the French throne. That dispute evolved into the 100 Years' War. It took Edward's attention away from Scotland, and David's 8th regent launched a guerrilla campaign and managed to push Balliol out of the country. David, now 17, and his 20-year-old queen returned to Scotland. The peasants were delighted, but nobles had some reservations. They had been free to do as they wished for 8 years, and weren't keen on answering to a king. The most powerful was Robert Stewart. He was the son of Robert the Bruce's eldest daughter, Marjorie. Robert was 8 years older than David, and until the young king fathered a child, Robert was heir presumptive. David took an immediate dislike to his nephew and pushed him to the outskirts of the royal circle. When his mentor, Philip VI, was defeated at the Battle of Crécy, the teenage king was eager to support him and prove himself in battle. He attacked northern England, but he was defeated and captured at the Battle of Neville's Cross. King David was held prisoner in the Tower of London, but later moved to a luxurious house arrest at Windsor Castle. Edward III was his brother-in-law after all, and they had a decent relationship. Edward allowed his sister Joan to visit her husband, though the couple didn't get along and never conceived a child. Robert Stewart was left in charge of Scotland, and he had no intention of ransoming his uncle. But when he got word that David and Edward were conspiring to make one of Edward's sons the next King of Scotland, he was outraged. Robert got the support of the new King of France, Jean II, to officially become king, but Jean was promptly killed in battle, and Robert had no choice but to agree to pay a hefty ransom for David. He arrived back in Scotland after 11 years away, without his wife Joan, whom he had been estranged from for several years. Scotland had no patience for their prodigal king. David tried to regain control, but he needed an heir. He brought his mistress, Catherine Mortimer, but she was murdered by an ally of the Stewart family. The king arrested the man involved and had him starved to death. When he got word from England that his wife had died, he married a Scottish lady, Margaret Drummond. 6 years into the marriage, Margaret had not given birth to any children. She did have children from a previous marriage, while David never fathered any, in or out of wedlock. So it is most likely that he was infertile. But the king moved on to a new mistress and tried to annul his marriage. The queen would not go without a fight and appealed to the Pope. Just as David was gearing up for potentially years of legal battles, he died at 46. As he had no children, Robert Stewart took the throne. The House of Stewart took its name from Walter FitzAlan, who held the title of High Steward of Scotland, meaning he was in charge of the royal household of King David I in the 1150s. The family held the position and became increasingly powerful over the next 150 years. Walter's descendant, Walter Stewart, 6th High Steward of Scotland, fought courageously at the Battle of Bannockburn. The victory allowed Robert I to regain the freedom of his wife, sister, and daughter Marjorie. Walter was sent to England to bring them home, and he was rewarded with Princess Marjorie's hand in marriage. While heavily pregnant, 19-year-old Marjorie was thrown from her horse. She gave birth to a son, but died shortly after. Her only child was Robert II, the Stewart. He was crowned king at 55. His health was failing and he was going blind. But he had fathered 14 children over the course of 2 marriages, not to mention a number of illegitimate offspring. When he was crowned, he had 3 living adult sons who were granted earldoms. John became Earl of Carrick, Robert Earl of Fife, and Alexander Earl of Badenoch. The king's 4 unwed daughters were married off to other powerful earls, so 7 out of the 16 earldoms of Scotland were suddenly under Stuart control. After centuries of Scottish kings who didn't have enough heirs, Robert's large brood securing the succession was a refreshing change. That was until the boys started acting up. The youngest, Alexander, became known as the Wolf of Badenoch for his thuggish terrorizing of the Highlands. In the south, eldest brother John Earl of Carrick and his lords were hungry to raid England and resented the king's reluctance to go to war. John called his father out in Parliament for failing to deal with the wolf or England. He claimed the king was too feeble to rule, and he was appointed lieutenant of the kingdom. John's leadership was short-lived, as he was kicked by a horse and incapacitated. Middle brother Robert Earl of Fife replaced him as lieutenant. King Robert spent his twilight years as a figurehead. He died at 74, leaving his sons to fight over the throne. The next king was Robert III, the Lame. He was not the middle brother Robert Earl of Fife, but rather the elder brother John. He chose the regnal name Robert in order to be associated with his father and great-grandfather, rather than the disastrous King John Balliol, and to be confusing. But Robert the King was still largely incapacitated, so Robert the Earl remained in power. The king had great hope in his 12-year-old son, David. His wife, Queen Annabella, built alliances with key earls and got them to end Fife's lieutenancy and allowed David to assist his father in ruling. David was created Duke of Rothesay, the first dukedom in Scotland. Fife was also upgraded to Duke of Albany. At 18, Prince David was planning to marry Elizabeth, the daughter of the powerful Earl of March, but his father stopped the union. The bitter son turned on his father and allied with his uncle, Albany, and together they had the king once again declared incapacitated. Prince David was named lieutenant with Albany as his counsel. He wed Marjorie Douglas, daughter of the most powerful non-Stewart in the land. But when his mother, Queen Annabella, died, his behavior became unruly. He embezzled state funds and blatantly cheated on his wife. His uncle and father-in-law arrested him, and he was starved to death. Albany once again took control, but he didn't have an easy time of it. He suffered defeats against the English and against his brother, the Wolf of Badenoch. His elder brother, who was still technically King Robert III, was able to make an unlikely comeback. He set up a new court, made alliances, and spread rumors of miracles associated with his murdered son. He put his hopes in his second son, 10-year-old James. While the prince was traveling through the countryside, his party was ambushed by Douglas men. The prince escaped and boarded a ship for France, but he was captured by English pirates and taken to King Henry IV, who imprisoned him in the Tower of London. The shock of his son's capture was too much for King Robert. On his deathbed, he requested that he be buried in a dung heap, with the epitaph, "Here lies the worst king and the most wretched of men in the whole kingdom." Robert III died at 66, and he was laid to rest in Paisley Abbey, not a dung heap. James I was declared king in absentia at 12, but Albany remained in control of Scotland. He had no interest in negotiating for James's return, so the king remained in England for 8 years. He was treated well as a prisoner of King Henry IV. He lived in the royal household and was even made a Knight of the Garter. He was given an excellent education and exposed to Renaissance ideas just beginning to reach England. James excelled in wrestling, tennis, literature, and music. When Henry V inherited the throne, he went all in on the 100 Years' War and brought James with him to France. The Scottish army was also there, but fighting for the French, their longtime allies. During a battle, Henry ordered James to order the Scots to surrender. They ignored their king and fought on. The English won, and those Scots who survived the battle were hanged as traitors. Naturally, this made the Scottish king very unpopular with his own people. James fell in love with Joan Beaufort, daughter of the Earl of Somerset, and the pair were married. Henry V died of dysentery at 35, and his 9-month-old son became King Henry VI. The English lords were keen to have the thoroughly Anglified Scottish king back on his own throne as their ally. Albany had died, so the English forced his son, Murdoch, to come and ransom James and take him back home. King James I was 29 when he was finally crowned at Scone. He tried to introduce many of the Renaissance ideas he had learned in England, most significantly the king's singular authority over the government. He was not popular with the Scottish lords, who had been operating just fine without a king, and now had to pay higher taxes and send 21 of their own children as hostages to cover his ransom. James and Murdoch, who was his heir until he had a son of his own, faced off in a Cold War. James was unable to censure his rival because the Scottish army, still fighting in France in the 100 Years' War, supported Murdoch. But at the Battle of Verneuil, the Scots were wiped out. James moved quickly to arrest and execute Murdoch. Now James I had control over Scotland. The French sent an impressive envoy to offer him money and a marriage between his daughter Margaret and Louis le Dauphin in exchange for more soldiers. James accepted the money, but took his time sending Margaret and the troops. Not to be outdone, the English sent their own embassy with an offer for Margaret to wed Henry VI if the Scots joined their side in the war. James played both sides and did not commit. After 5 daughters, Queen Joan finally gave birth to twin sons, securing the succession. James had been collecting taxes to pay his own ransom and release the 21 noble hostages. But instead, he kept the money and used it to build Linlithgow Palace and provide for his own lavish lifestyle. The once athletic king grew overweight on expensive food and wine. Once James ran through the ransom money, he demanded more from his people. Resentment was reaching a climax. Meanwhile, France took the upper hand in the 100 Years' War, partly thanks to Joan of Arc. James finally decided to back the French, so he handed over his daughter Margaret and laid siege to English-held Roxburgh Castle. But his attack failed. James went to Parliament to ask for more war funds, but a fed-up MP denounced the king and tried to have him arrested. The MP was arrested instead, but the Lords had had enough. James and Joan left the mayhem to spend Christmas at Perth Friary. There they relaxed and James enjoyed playing tennis. But his tennis balls kept going down the sewer drain near the court, so he ordered that the drain be blocked off. One night, 7 conspirators stole into the royal apartments. They killed a page boy, and his screams alerted the royals. The bar for their chamber door could not be found, so a lady-in-waiting stuck her own arm into the door jamb to block the attackers. While she struggled, the royals used a fireplace poker to pry up a floorboard, and the king jumped into the sewer pipe below. The assassins broke the lady's arm and entered the room. But the king was nowhere in sight. They were about to leave when one assassin thought to look below the floor. There they found the king, covered in filth. He had been unable to escape because he'd previously ordered the drains to be blocked to save his tennis balls. In saving his balls, he had doomed himself. 2 assassins entered the drain, and James desperately fought them off, but the third managed to run the king through with his sword. King James, 42, was carried out of the sewer with 16 wounds. In the next episode, we'll meet more Stuart monarchs, one who inspired the Red Wedding scene in Game of Thrones, another whose vendetta against his uncle, Henry VIII, cost him his life, and Mary Queen of Scots, who plotted to assassinate her cousin Elizabeth I and lost her head for it. Thank you to Bruce at Scotland History Tours for helping me with the pronunciations in this series. If you want to take more deep dives into Scottish history, check out his excellent channel. A link is in the description. Want even more tea on history? Check out the History Tea Time podcast. A special thank you goes to my patrons, Isabella Petroni and Emily Schroeder. Don't want to wait to see the next episode? Patrons get exclusive early access to all of my multi-part series. If you would like to join my Patreon and help me make more fascinating videos, click on the link in the description. Thank you for watching.